Hey, everybody. Hi. I am going to be talking to you guys about Vue 3 building your first open source project. So let's just jump into it here. So who am I? So I am a developer at AWS. I work on the Amplify team, which is a set of tools that help front end and mobile developers create full stack applications using AWS services. You may have noticed me. I'm on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel called Program with Eric, and just recently, I am become at least for now a part-time developer advocate for the Amplify team. So, doing events like this, talking to people that use Amplify or AWS services is awesome. So, hit me up, and also I'm at EricCH on Twitter. Uh, all right. So for this lightning talk, we're going to cover 4 different areas. So we're going to first do a quick thought experiment with everybody here that's watching. I want you guys to think about it, and then we're going to look at how I created with our team our Amplify library and the design choices and requirements that we had. We're going to look at lessons learned and what we learned through it, and then the conclusion of it all. All right. So think about this. Let's imagine you want to create a Vue 3 library. Now, how should you build it? Now, let's assume that you already have the UI. Maybe you have to build it for your company or for a special project. But what are the pieces? What are the things that you would need to do it? And I think we've seen from previous speakers today and yesterday that there's a lot to this. So first, what kind of build tools should you use? Vue CLI or Vite? Don't even Vue CLI is in maintenance mode, but don't count it out. It could be still used. Vite is obviously a really popular, or you might even just use something like Rollup and just create it all yourself and not use any of these. Uh, TypeScript's been talked a lot about. Should you use JavaScript or TypeScript? I mean, you kind of need to make that distinction. Options API or composition API. Pinya or something like xState or Vuex or a different kind of state management system, or do you need any state management system at all? And then I know in the Vue world, JSX isn't always liked, but there might be some instances you might want to use JSX. And the nice thing about the Vue ecosystem is that it's supported. And if you look at Vuetify, and the new version of Vuetify, they use JSX everywhere instead of templates or render functions. So you can see that the right answer is not always obvious. So we're going to go into some things I think will work for us. So this is what we did. So I was trying to find a good XKCD article to put in here. So this is what I came up with. So how do you write good code? Obviously, start the project, do things right or do them fast. Uh, as software developers, we're probably going to try to do things right. So you code well. Are you done yet? Kind of in that circle, keep going back and forth. No, and the requirements have changed. Throw it all out and start over again. So typically, a lot of times this happens. You know, we're always throwing things out, and this process continues. So, but let's talk about the project. So I'll talk about it in a second, but the requirements for our open source project that we're creating, and this is actually the requirements I had for the project, was accessibility is extremely important, especially we're dealing with UI components. Small bundle size. No one likes to look up in bundle phobia and see like you have a huge bundle size. We, at the same time we were creating our Vue version of our library, we wanted to make sure we had React and Angular versions. So we wanted to make sure we're sharing code. We also wanted to follow Vue 3's best practices, which we'll talk about, and then of course testing. So this is what we built. This is the authenticator. After the talk, I'll put a link to it if you guys are interested. But it's a way basically you can add authentication, authorization into your app by just putting this one component, and then it can talk to our AWS services, our Cognito services, and it kind of takes all that worry out. And then it's really customizable too with the colors and theming and things like that. So a little bit of history. We had 2 prior versions. The last version was creating using Stencil with web components, kind of look like this on the right-hand side. We definitely found some stuff with the web components we didn't love, so we wanted to rewrite it. So we had a Vue version, a React, and Angular, and then we do also offer Flutter and iOS support too, but we wanted to kind of do it a little differently. So let's kind of deep dive into kind of what we did. For the accessibility, we tested against WCAG 2.1a. So we used screen readers. We used a handful of WCAG tools to test. So every single component had all the best practices, all your ARIA labels, everything to go with accessibility. We also had an accessibility audit team that looked at the component afterwards to make sure we didn't miss anything. For bundle size, we were very particular we reduced the number of dependencies. Anything that we said we didn't need, we didn't put in. And we decided to use Vite with ESM for our builder, but we also exported to CJS. So we kind of had both best of both worlds, but we felt Vite was really good. Sharing of code. This is kind of this is the diagram we use. So we created some internal packages. That's AWS Amplify UI. It had xState and utils, and we'll talk about xState in a minute. And that was the shared package that we used with a React and Angular and Vue version. And the utils were like common code that each one of these different packages used. So why xState? So first, we really like the idea of a finite state machine. If you're not familiar, xState really works well for state machines. It has native libraries for Vue and Angular and React. It had really great package support and it looked really interesting. So I thought this would be a great state management system that we can put at the higher level that all the other kind of packages would use. And so for Vue 3 best practices, we went with obviously composition API. This was actually over a year ago, so it wasn't composition API with script setup wasn't probably as popular as it is today, but we decided to go with that. We use single file components with templates. We looked at using JSX or render functions or some other way, but we wanted to make sure that if people came in, since it is an open source project, that they would be familiar with it. And so we use templates. We use TypeScript. We put a strict turned on. We turned ESLinting on. We used the Vue 3 Essential. We'll talk about that in a second. And then we use lots of slots, vModels, emits. Sometimes when you look at Vue apps written by maybe people are just learning it for the first time or came from React, you might see like kind of reactive way, a more React way of creating Vue apps. And we wanted to make sure we were using this stuff built into Vue. So testing. We use Vue test utils with testing library. If you don't know, testing library is a great testing library is a great utility that helps you create tests as if you were the user and you have to have accessibility in mind when you do your selects. And then we built it. You can use it with Vue test utils. We use Cypress for end-to-end tests and use something called Cucumber. And then we had GitHub actions to run our integ tests on every single for a canary and our PR. So every time we would do anything, all the tests would run. And here's an example of Cypress Cucumber. See here, we have it really puts writing Cypress tests like you're writing human readable form here. So you have a scenario, you can put whens and ands in there, and this worked really well, especially so we can kind of form our tests in a different way. And now this is all backed behind it with actual code, but it made a lot of sense to us. So lessons learned, we're wrapping up here. So what went well? So we really found at the end, I created the Vue library. We had someone else create the React and Angular library, and the parity between them was synced through the whole thing, and that worked well, especially with the architecture we created. TypeScript sped up the development by a lot. I think there's no doubt that TypeScript's the way you should go to create any modern application nowadays, and libraries included. Testing really caught a lot of issues. We did tons of end-to-end testing. We had dozens and dozens of end-to-end tests, which we really thought helped catch a lot of different issues as if you were the users, but it had a cost, obviously. We'll talk about that in a second. And we had a lot of positive customer feedback. But what could we have done better? There's so many great ESLint levels in your code. We definitely put a Vue 3 recommended, but we didn't. We should have put a higher level, put more ESLint rules because it could have caught some more issues. So Vue 2 support was dropped. So our libraries for Vue 3, but we do have an older library. Like I said, the legacy one that actually still supports Vue 2, just a new library. We didn't. We could have used something like Vue.js, which is a great library, but at the time it was a little bit too new, so we didn't use it. We actually could have used more JSX, at least in our tests. I think that would have helped out because we had a team of a lot of other React developers. And we could have, we did a lot of slots within slots within slots within slots, and it became a little bit crazy. And with all the end-to-end tests, it was certainly, it took a long time to run our end-to-end test suite. I think we should have done more unit tests using the testing library. So how did it go? You can see here, we had 10, we started a little over 10,000, and by the end, we doubled the amount of downloads. We had a lot of people using it, and we're really happy, and it's still growing to this day. Cool. So if you need any more information, tweet me at ErikCH.
Yay! I'm getting there. It's always like that pause at the end of like, are they going to say more? Are they done? Are they not done? I don't want to cut anybody off, which I mean could be funny, but you know, try to give them the opportunity. And I love that somebody called me out on Twitter. They're like, Jen's saying the same thing over and over and over again. And you're right. I am going to ask you, Windows, Mac, or other? What's your
Yeah,
operating system?
So my work, I use a Mac, and I'm a big fan. At home, I use Windows and Mac. So I don't really have too big of a preference for one or the other. For gaming, I always use Windows, but for a lot of work stuff and software, I use a Mac.
Fair enough. I think that's one of the biggest reasons I don't have a Windows computer anymore. I used to be a World of Warcraft addict, and that's maybe a good reason for me to stick with Mac. But more about OSS. When is the perfect time for a developer to start contributing to open source?
That's great. Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't get too much into the open source in this talk, but you know, I feel like there's so many great open source projects out there that you can start at the beginning of your of your journey of learning software development, or the journey of the person putting out the open source project. You want to look on GitHub and see for usually they put tags on them, and they might have a tag say like good for beginners or good for new people, and then try to pick one of those up. Just realize it is kind of a process. You have to read through the documentation of any open source project you look through, look at their contribution guidelines. You might find that it's not quite right for you. So you kind of have to kind of pick and choose. But I think everyone should at some point just check out some open source projects that they like and try to contribute. If not contribute, there's so many ways you can now actually support developers who create open source projects. And I think it's even built into GitHub right now, where if you see someone you really like that has a bunch of open source projects, you can contribute like $5 a month or whatever to them. So I really think at any time's good.
I love that. And yeah, GitHub sponsors is one of the many ways. There's so many open source options out there. And there, even though it's not October, everyone could also like watch or look up Hacktoberfest just because it gives people an idea. And one, I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but have you ever heard of Dougie with open sauced?
No, I haven't.
It's just a great open source or Dougie. If you look them up on Twitter, they have a lot of really good open source options too to get people started. But can you mention any other projects that you've contributed to?
Yeah, I contributed to the Ghost for a little while, so I was sending pull requests to there for open source projects, and we in the AWS ecosystem, we have so many different libraries and so many different places where people can, as us developers can contribute to. So I've definitely contributed to some of the other open source projects at AWS, including the docs, which I think is really important to make sure our docs are up to date.
Very awesome. That is something that we were talking about on the panel earlier, is like how important it is to work on docs. What are some things that someone should look out for when looking for an open source project to contribute to?
Yeah, that's a good question. Uh, well, I did remember one more thing. I do have a bunch of other smaller open source projects on my GitHub, including one on YouTube channels. So if anybody's interested in contributing to that, I'll make a shout out for that. But so what things should you look out for when looking for an open source project to contribute to? Well, first, I would say, is the open source project, is it something that could be helpful to you? Is it something that you're passionate about? Is something that you want to contribute to? That might be the first kind of level that you want to think about. Is something that you would be interested in? Because obviously, I don't think it's a
Mhm.
good idea to contribute to something you have no need for, don't care about.
100%, 100%.
You may also want to look at how many stars it has, although that's not always super important. How many issues are on the issue list?
Mhm,
How active the project is. A lot of open source projects die after a certain amount of months or years, and it's just kind of sitting there and no one's taking it. And that might be a indication if you want to contribute to it or not. So I would go into the
mhm,
issues. If they have discussions open on GitHub, look at discussions of anybody talking. How good is their contribution guidelines? Does it make sense to does it actually tell you what you can do, or you're kind of lost? You can
mhm.
really tell the health of a project by the documentation that it has.
I
Those are a
think
few
that's
things.
yeah, I think that's a great call out because like my website is open sourced and I'm like, cool, if anybody wants to grab it, like go for it. But I'm still learning. So it is not set up in a very readable way yet. So it's definitely, I totally get, and I love how you called that out of like even looking at the stars and what other people are contributing to it, how many contributors, like all of those are great ideas. How would you describe the impact of what open source community has had on the Vue.js framework?
Yeah, it's incredible impact. Of course, being the framework itself being open source, but then having so many contributors, so many different projects out there that have made so many cool things that make things easier for us developers. It's essential for I think any kind of framework or library, be it React or Angular, Vue. I mean, the lifeblood of it is how many people are using it, and then how many people are building upon it and creating cool things that make it easier to do stuff like Nuxt and Vuedemi and Vuetify and we've seen today. There's it's extremely important to see that. Obviously, if there was nothing, then I would be nervous to use it.
Very true. Very true. Just because we're talking about this, keeping it on the same wavelength, and then we got another one after this. Of what would you do differently if you started the project today?
Yeah, I think if I started the project today, I would kind of talked about a little bit in the talk is my lessons learned is to really focus on more of less on the end to end and kind of balance it more with unit and smaller integration type tests and really focus on that more would have been like definitely one thing we would have done better. We may have added Vuedemi, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's a library that allows you to kind of create Vue 3 libraries and Vue 2 at the same time. You probably would have added that in quicker at the beginning too. So a few things like that. ESLinting, we would probably put a little bit higher. More JSX at some point, at least with the tests. So,
All right. Last question
all
for
right.
you. Is using Vite for Vue 2 project with Amplify UI components possible?
So this is a good question. I believe so. I have not tried it because our older library works great. So we have a newer library I've been talking about in this talk. That's a Vue 3 library, and then we have an older library for Amplify. It's called UI Amplify, and it has the same kind of functionality as the Authenticator. But it was written really with Vue CLI in mind because Vite didn't exist back then. So it's kind of more in maintenance mode right now. I haven't tested it with Vite, so I'm gonna have to double check on that.
We that yep. Okay, making sure I got all of them.
Oh, we got
there
more?
there's
We got more, Jen?
uh Let me double check. I think we got them all. We got them all. But I'm just curious, like when because so many people talk about open source, and there's like this idea of if you, I don't know, that open source is so scary. And that's something that, the panel answered a little bit today. But how would you talk about like removing the fear of just getting started with open source?
Yeah, removing the fear. Well, maybe it kind of goes back to, finding a project that you're interested in that sounds really good, and then finding the right issue to tackle at first, and maybe even like you had just mentioned that the service gen, maybe going through one of those, looking at some of the other guidelines, doing some more research, talking to maybe other people that have contributed to open source projects. Maybe all that together would kind of lessen the fear, because I think what people might think is like, I don't know enough to contribute. I mean, even if you just
Hmm.
like start at the docs, I bet everybody who's listening right now could go to their favorite open source project and just read through the docs and find a mistake or find an area, like either a typo, or maybe they'll find an area that just needs a little more information, and that's like
Hmm.
perfect. You could then open up an issue, say, hey, I found this. Are you guys interested I contribute to it? I would make sure you open up an issue first and explain what
Hmm.
you think you can contribute before just contributing it, especially if an issue isn't already open. But maybe that would be possibly one way to keep not be so scared on it, is just to start with like simpler, easier issues, documentation, things like that would be helpful.
I love that. And I think it's so on point because like even we were talking about accessibility earlier in the conference, even if somebody is like, oh, it says click here for, and they link the here, that is not accessible. People don't know what they're clicking if they're using a screen reader. And that's something that people can really help out with contributing to open source. And I love that you talked about it and brought up such a good topic with Vue 3 and starting a project. So thank you, Eric. And anything you want to let us know? Last part today.
Yeah, if you have any questions, tweet me at EricCH, and yeah, I'll be more than happy, and then I'll link to the slides if anyone's interested there too. And then if you want to get more information about Amplify, um, I'll link there too. You can just Google Amplify AWS.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you.